Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the second lecture for Drugs and International Politics as a replacement for the July 16th class meeting session. In this video, we are going to run the same sort of exercise on mafias that we've already run on the states and corporations, the other institutions that we might use to manage market failures. So here we're going to take a look at the circumstances under which people might engage in using a mafia and the services that a mafia might provide. This is going to cover the readings from Diego Gambetta and David Scarbeck. As we go through this lecture, here's a couple of questions to ponder. As with our last few lectures, the authors this week consider how the structure of certain markets or certain societies incentivize or reward actors that create protection rackets. So in the same way that Tilly or Olson argued that states are protection rackets, here we're going to take a look at the idea that an explicit protection racket, that of a mafia, is incentivized in certain markets in certain states, particularly markets that have been prohibited. And in the first lecture of this class, we talked about the logic of prohibition a little bit. We can test the implications of these models by examining the behavior of mafia members, the behavior of mafia customers, and the behavior of the state when a mafia is present. So this exercise not only tells us empirically about what mafias do, it also gives us some better theoretical understanding of what governance and power and control in a market space really mean. So we might ask ourselves, when do common citizens turn to the protection of organized crime? Why would some people deal with mafias? Presumably most of you don't deal with mafias in your day-to-day commercial lives. So under certain circumstances, though, you might be tempted. Building on from that, what types of markets are likely to engage with mafias? How do the mafiosi decide when they're going to offer services? They have the option to refuse service. What clients are attractive to them? And then lastly, when might a state tolerate or even prefer to have a mafia present? Okay, at the center of our analysis today is the mafiosi. Gambetta's study of the mafia posits that this character's survival and ability to profit is embedded in a series of games. Unlike Scarbeck, Gambetta's description of the mafia derives from his conversation with mafiosi, their clients, law enforcement and government officers who've been tasked with confronting the mafia. So Gambetta opens up discussing a character he names Tio Pepe. What is the difference between Tio Pepe and the man of respect? Okay, sort of as a threshold issue, Tio Pepe arrives on the scene in order to provide information that helps diffuse an information asymmetry. In the example that Gambetta uses, you have a butcher who is attempting to sell a butchered cow. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the butcher is buying a cow from a cowboy. Either way, the buyer doesn't have complete information about the quality of the cow. They're not used to evaluating these sorts of transactions. So Tio Pepe can come in and for a small fee, he essentially runs Carfax on the cow, Cowfax. The man of respect is different because the man of respect, in addition to providing some Tio Pepe-like advice on whether to engage in the transaction, backs his guarantee with violence. So the mafioso works particularly on behalf of one of the parties to the transaction, inspects the transaction for any indicia of fraud, and once he certifies the transaction, guarantees that his representation is true or he will take violent retribution on whoever in the transaction is not his client. And so we end up with several games that a mafia member needs to play in order to remain in the game and profitable. The first is the game that they play with long-term clients. What sorts of protection does a mafiosi offer the client and when? Under what circumstances might he abandon an old client in favor of protecting someone new? Even this game has multiple moving parts. How does the mafiosi judge the profit potential of his old client against the new client? What would the abandonment of a client signal to his other clients and his competitors? Of course, this implies that we have a second game. Mafioso need to consider how to treat outsiders. When does he help them broker good deals, and when does he fleece them on purpose? The outsider knows that a mafioso might attempt to fleece him, so what strategies might be available to an outsider to the community, and how might the mafioso respond to those strategies? How are the strategies to avoid getting fleeced different between the old client and the new client? Third, a mafioso needs to manage relations with competitors. How does the mafioso signal willingness to commit violence without taking on too many unnecessary costs? Violence is costly, as we'll see later in the lecture. How do we manage this cost against the benefits that are delivered from being violent? And then lastly, the mafioso needs to manage his relationship with the state. So in total, we can see that a mafioso's behavior is dictated or conditioned by his attempts to maximize the outcome of a number of games all at the same time. Let's start at the beginning. Why would anyone need mafia support in the first place? Well, as we saw in Gambetta, the mafia is a replacement for a state that can no longer provide protection or never provided protection against an informational asymmetry. We remember the problem of the informational asymmetry. The buyer, player 2, doesn't know which situation they're in. They don't know whether they are looking at a good horse or a bad horse, and therefore they don't know how to judge the difference between the buy and pass outcomes for them. We also remember one of the obvious solutions, right? Where we have a good car and a bad car. We have the possibility of a Carfax-style company or a seller guarantee that comes in and allows us to return or pass on the car because we know whether it's a good car or a bad car prior to purchasing. A few things that we need to consider, though, that weren't included in that first informational asymmetry model that become important for understanding the behavior of mafias. The first is that Carfax actually costs money. So a completed sale of a good car yields a profit to Carfax. Now the profit to Carfax should still leave the best equilibrium at the sale of the car. We're still Pareto optimal here. We're still maximizing our community level outcomes versus buying a bad car style outcome. If we assume that Carfax is unwilling to protect bad cars, or that people with bad cars simply won't register them on Carfax because they don't want the information about how bad their car is out to the public, the equilibrium in this model remains the same even though you are paying Carfax money. So there's a part of the market that Carfax isn't profiting from. Carfax isn't making any money from bad cars. Doesn't this provide Carfax with an incentive to oblige a player 1 who's willing to overpay for a fake report? Might Carfax be interested in overselling or overcharging a player 1 that has a bad car? What do you think? Do you think that Carfax could ever be persuaded or bribed to certify that a bad car is a good car? Well, there are a handful of considerations that Carfax needs to take into account when they make this decision. The return of expected returns, right? We need to be asking ourselves what the likely cost and benefit of protecting a bad car on Carfax is going to be. The first factor we need to consider when we calculate the expected returns to Carfax of certifying bad cars as good cars is that Carfax can handle an infinite number of customers, right? Carfax has got it down now. They can get your information from your state DMV, from the VIN number. They can look for any sorts of reports on the car, and they can generate these reports relatively seamlessly. There's no limit to the number of cars that they can protect at the same time. The second, probably the most intuitive and important part of this answer, is that new customers choose Carfax primarily based on reputation. If Carfax goes out and certifies a bunch of bad cars as good cars, fewer people will use Carfax, and its ability to profit from being a mitigator of an informational asymmetry will erode. Third, Carfax is a market leader in a legal industry. Carfax probably isn't going anywhere. It's unlikely that someone is going to come up with some new way to run Carfax reports that's even more efficient than Carfax and displace them. Their business model seems pretty well locked up. Fourth, Carfax is owned publicly by shareholders and employees. I get maybe the employees don't own it, but the employees are invested in Carfax's performance. They want stable returns. They want to keep their jobs. They'd like Carfax to stay in business. And then lastly, Carfax and its employees are subject to penalties for fraud. So in sum, what you might say here is that Carfax has a long time horizon. Carfax believes or has a business model that allows it to believe that it can survive into the future and it can maximize its long-term profits by keeping a good business reputation and attracting lots and lots of new clients. They might sacrifice $1 today for a load of 25-cent payments over the next few years because they are confident that they are actually going to receive those payments and confident that they're actually going to be around as a company to make and keep that money. Is this calculus different for a mafioso? What are the expected returns to certifying a bad car for a mafioso? Well, for starters, as we learned from Gambetta, some of the most interesting sections of Gambetta, the customer base of a mafioso is limited by that mafioso's intelligence gathering capacity. A mafioso needs to monitor his client's secrets and the secrets of the business partners that his client seeks to engage with in order to threaten them. So this limits the number of customers that a mafioso can take on. Decisions about whether you take on a new client or screw them over depends a lot upon whether your intelligence gathering capacity is full. Now, a mafia might increase its intelligence capacity by hiring more people to go look for intelligence. Maybe we should step back here. Think for a second about the examples of intelligence gathering that Gambetta provides, right? You have old men sitting out in front of gas stations or convenience stores acting like they're playing checkers. You have kids who are skipping school playing on the street. You have lots and lots of eyes everywhere, right? This is sort of Lord Varys' little birds from Game of Thrones, if you're familiar. So every time you want to increase your intelligence gathering capacity, you need to find new little birds. And what problem arises every time you hire a new employee? Hopefully, you all immediately leapt toward the principal agent problem, a different and specialized type of informational asymmetry. So mafias can't expand that quickly because they need to hire and train and vet and verify new spies in order to have a high enough intelligence gathering capacity to take on new clients. So this return from new business is actually relatively slow. It's not guaranteed that every new client is someone that the mafia can or will want to take on. New customers choose their mafias primarily based on geography and market. Right? There's not some big internet clearinghouse for mafias in the way there is between Carfax and its competitive organizations. And occasionally what you want to be doing then is reminding your customers that they need you in the first place. They may be more tempted to drop out and just take whatever protection the state has. If you want to hammer home that no one else can help them, it might be a good idea to either screw them over once in a while and remind them of what life without you is like, or to make a demonstration out of someone who's not your client and comes to you for help for the first time. So you may actually get more repeat business if you target potential new clients occasionally to screw them over. Third, mafias engage in a marketplace for violent protection that is itself violent. And there's no recourse to law enforcement if you are a mafia member who gets screwed over by a competitor or by a client, which is related to the next point or reiterated in it. There's a temptation then to maximize your profits before you exit. And exit here is definitely a euphemism for die. Finally, mafioso are subject to penalties for existing, right? There's no special sanction for fraud if you're already a Goomba. So there's no downside to screwing people over extra. So as a result, we might think that the mafia is more tempted to screw over clients than Carfax because they have a short time horizon and a limited number of ways to profit from their existing clients. The chances that player 2, some new player 2 who wanders into a mafia member's orbit, will provide the mafioso with 7 or 8 transactions worth of income and thus meet the mafioso's expected return to provide protection rather than screw him over in a one-off deal depends a lot then on the ease with which a particular mafioso can spy on the client and the client's business partners, and the chances that he's going to survive enough rounds of the mafia game to actually get the money from those transactions. To make things even more complicated, Gambetta argues that mafioso need to pick suckers occasionally that demonstrate their power to protect their own clients without angering their clients. So as you can see, there's a lot going on in the mafioso's decision-making process when it comes to determining how many clients to take on and how to treat them. Given that the mafioso is under pressure to defect, a pressure to defect that doesn't exist with the government or businesses like Carfax, why would you expect a customer to prefer to work with the mob? Let's unpack this just a little bit, right? When you sign up for Carfax, you know that there's no temptation for Carfax to give you a bad car report because we've just been through this exercise that shows you it's not in their interests. Their long-term interest would be frustrated if they angered a bunch of clients like you. And so their self-interest is part of what allows you to trust that organization, that they're going to give you the right information. But clients of the mafia don't have that guarantee. If their patron mafioso's time horizon becomes short enough, the mafioso is going to screw them over. So why, under what circumstances is a person incentivized to take on this risk to deal with a mafia member? Well, the first is that you have no legal options for guarantors or information, right? You work in a prohibited field. You're selling cocaine, you're selling marijuana, you're selling something for which you cannot sue if your business partners or your supply chain screws you over. And therefore, the only protection that's available to you is one that is less stable. Second, maybe you work in a specialized type of industry that requires specialized knowledge. Gambetta provides an example of this in the chapter that was assigned, right? Lots and lots of mafioso in Sicily got their start protecting fish selling businesses on the shore, right? These fishermen haul up fish. They want to sell them right away before they go bad. People prize fresh fish. The government wasn't getting there fast enough to make sure that the fish were certified in some sort of way before they were spoiled. And so there was a demand for non-state fish rating organizations, especially, and for protection against people who would claim that your fish were not up to standard, or from people who sold you substandard fish because they got some sort of certification from an untrustworthy mafioso. So in this circumstance, you need an organization that has this specialized knowledge that can react to your demand more quickly than, say, the government. The last is tax avoidance, right? You can make any legal market illegal by selling without tax. And if the taxes are high enough, it might make sense to contract a mafioso to guarantee your deals rather than availing yourselves of the state. We talked very briefly in class about how the cigarette market works this way. There are lots of trafficked cigarettes within the United States and from the United States through Africa into Europe that come in without being assessed their import duties. And so as a result, all of these transactions would need to be guaranteed by mafias rather than states as well. It is for this reason that one of the other sort of grandfathers of modern criminology, Thomas Schelling, argued that the chief victims of crime of the mafia are criminals themselves, right? Schelling and Gambetta share a model of the mafia that is functionally state-like. When we talk about organized crime, we are talking entirely about groups that provide violent protection to smooth out relationships in illegal industries. These are service providers to criminals. They are states for criminals. Remember, in the coming weeks, we're going to assess alternate models of mafias that posit that mafias, or organized crime, I guess I should say, functions more like a corporation or functions more like a free market. There is no such thing as organized crime in the last model. When we're talking about mafias, that really is a term of art that means organized crime that is state-like. Unless I mess up, you'll never hear me refer to a drug trafficking cartel as a mafia, because baked into our understanding of what a cartel means is a corporate model of how a mafia functions, or a corporate model. See, there we go, a corporate model of how organized crime functions. When I'm talking about a mafia, I'm always talking about a state-centered view of how organized crime functions. Okay, I digress. Next, let's discuss the relationship between a mafioso and his competitors, including the competitor of the state. Violence presents something of a paradox for a mafia member. Of course, this is what they're intended to provide. So, uses of violence. What's the upside of a mafia being violent? The first upside is that you're providing the services that are expected to you from cheated or threatened customers. You actually need to provide violence in order to have anyone continue to pay you, unless mafias are completely extortionate, right? We've all sort of heard the stories of the mafioso that walk into a convenience store or a shoe store, and they tap their hand lightly into their palm. This is a nice business, sure would be a shame if it burned down. These are, broadly, Gambetta argues, popular misconceptions of how mafias work. Why is that not a stable business arrangement for a mafia to come in, threaten businesses, threaten to harm the business unless the business owner pays a certain fee for the mafia's protection? Why isn't that stable? Think about what you would do if someone came into your business and made that threat. Where might you go if you live in the United States? Let's say you live in a place like La Jolla. Probably where you'd go first is the police, which means that you would engage, if you believe Tilly or Olson, a competitive mafia that actually does provide services. So the only way for mafias to get a stable business model running is to actually provide protection for clients who might need it from someone. Certainly it's true that mafias might punish non-payment by violence against their own clients, but their main product can't just be extortion, or a competitive mafia that's capable of rooting out extortion, up to and including the state, will come along and challenge them. You need to actually provide a protective service that matters. Second use of violence is that you can use it to deter other mafiosi looking for new turf. We are going to talk, when we do our case study of La Familia Michoacan, in more depth about this, but we often see, particularly in the Mexican drug smuggling context, lots and lots of irrationally spectacular violence, right? Heads on a dance floor, mutilated bodies hung from highway overpasses. And we think to ourselves that these cannot possibly be right-thinking people. Well, morally they might not be, but in terms of business, it's very possible that they have a good model going. If you appear to be crazy, if you make sort of this unassailable image for yourself that you are irrationally violent, you are going to dissuade competitors from tangling with you on your turf. Okay, so these are the two potential uses of violence, ways in which the mafia might use violence to profit when it provides services, or to lower the cost of doing business when it deters other mafioso from coming to look at turf that's competitive. But of course, violence is also costly. What are the downsides to using violence? Okay, so for one, it eats profits, right? We'll discuss this a little bit in more detail in the coming slides, but violence is costly. You have to actually employ people whose job it is to shoot other people, and those people cost money, and that's not money that's going into your pocket. Second, it's possible that your alternative mafioso, the people who you attack or whose clients you attack, are going to come back and get revenge on you. And they're going to cause losses to your business. They're going to destroy your assets. They're going to kill your employees who you now need to rehire and retrain. Or maybe even they're going to kill you, right? It also attracts police attention. Another thing that you hear occasionally in popular culture representations of how drug markets work that is a little bit more accurate is that police officers and police agencies often ignore drug trafficking organizations if they're nonviolent. The cops care about the bodies. They're down here about the bodies. So if you're engaging in a lot of violence, you're attracting a lot of police attention, which requires that you take your organization even further underground. And as we'll talk about when we get to our week on the principal agent problem, when we read Shapiro and Berman, we'll see that this actually generates quite a bit of friction, quite a bit of inefficiency in organized criminal enterprise. So we can present then the use of violence between two separate mafias as something of a complicated game of chicken. Maybe you might even take a look at this and see that it looks most to you like a prisoner's dilemma. I think either one of those comparative models is justifiable. But here we can see that the Pareto optimal outcome for relations between two mafias is that they both engage in truce, in nonviolence. They continue their business, and if they're careful, they might be able to present their truce as a victory to their own clients and actually increase or expand their own reputation for being credible mafiosi. The problem, though, is that if one mafia calls a truce and the other mafia engages in violence, the mafia that called the truce falls behind in a gang war that might cause them to lose. You exit the stage if you lose this particular game of chicken. And so as a result, we know that our Nash equilibrium is likely to be a devastating mob war without knowing anything else about this situation, even though truce is our Pareto optimal income maximizing outcome. The devastating mob war is most likely to accrue. So just a few more words on this last relationship. Most of what I just said intuitively applies to the way that the mafia engages with its competitors and to the state. But as we saw from Tilly and Olson, by some theories, the state is just a legalized mafia. And so the mafia doesn't just represent a threat to the politician's ability to remain in office, it actually represents competition. But there might be circumstances under which the state would prefer that a mafia exists. Right? We know from both of the Fryman readings, for example, that when the state prohibits particular conduct, like selling drugs, it removes itself from the market for providing any sort of regulation for those substances. It's probably somewhat inevitable in these circumstances that the markets become violent. That competing mafias, if you believe in sort of a mafia model of organized crime, that competing mafias are going to cause violence, or competing distribution gangs or competing trafficking gangs are going to cause violence. And if you have a credible overarching mafia that reduces violence, you may actually get some of the benefits that you would get from legalization without actually having to legalize. You can maintain control over the social outcomes you promise your voters to engineer, which might include prohibition when people are pro-prohibition, and also maintain better peace if you delegate control of certain markets to mafias. Another place where we see mafias come into play, where the state occasionally seems all right with it, is when new ethnic groups migrate in mass to a new country. So I've spent a fair amount of time working in Somali populations here in the United States, and particularly when there were waves of refugees arriving from Somalia in the United States. Many of these refugees arrived without the social or language skills to fully integrate into American life right away. They were distrustful of the police because they were distrustful of the police back home, or whatever passed for law enforcement back home. And as a result, you have these communities that, in Scott's conception, are fundamentally illegible to the state. Right? These people speak Somali in tight-knit Somali communities, and they have social problems that they're not willing to go to the police for. And if they do go to the police have a hard time investigating because they don't understand very much about how these people act or what their communities are structured like. In these circumstances, it is not uncommon for the state police to cooperate with the elders or whoever they see as the most benign state replacement that functions in this new immigrant community, until those immigrants assimilate enough to life in the United States that they leave the pod, or the new place where their immigrants are kind of gathered from their same country. Okay, so with this, we'll move on to Skarbek. This is a really good point to start talking about Skarbek. Skarbek provides us a case study of how the Mexican mafia functions, and Skarbek draws heavily on Olson's model of the roving bandits. We remember, of course, the logic of the roving bandit problem. The bandits' willingness to leave villages with nothing, to come in and pillage all of the surplus, prevents the villages from growing and destroys years worth of surplus, right? So you have these villages who know that whatever they produce is just going to be taken from them by roving bandits, and therefore they don't produce at all. And somewhere down the line, after the roving bandits have decided to commit to protecting the growing economy, we have them setting optimal tax rates that grow their tax base and therefore their own wealth over time. Well, the logic of drug distribution gangs is a little bit different. Where roving bandits had to figure out credible commitment problems to settle long term, drug gangs face something more like a prisoner's dilemma. Say that you have a drug dealer, Avon Barksdale, for those of you who have not seen The Wire, and the dealer can decide how to split up the time and energy that his employees have between selling drugs and producing violence. In isolation, the choice is pretty obvious. If violence drains money rather than makes it, you'd ideally dedicate all of your capital to selling drugs and reinvest the profits in expanding your territory so that you can sell more drugs, just like a legal business would. But of course, when you expand, you meet the competition, which has the same choice between distribution and violence. So we see the problem. It looks a lot like a prisoner's dilemma. There's an incentive for one gang to commit violence against the other, no matter what the other gang chooses to do. You see that here, right? Our Pareto optimal outcome would be to sell. But we're likely to end up violence, because no matter what your partner drug cartel chooses to do, you could either make more money by selling out your truce and taking their territory at a cost, or if you think they're likely to sell you out, at least you survive to see the next round of profits. So because of this, we might expect that drug cartels, relations between drug cartels, drug-selling organizations and gangs, are likely to always be violent. But Skarbek argues that a mafia that can act like a state with drug gangs that act like its citizens might tax drug gangs to solve this problem. Remember from Gambetta that we have a similar suite of problems here with violence that affects drug gangs. The more capital you assign to violence, the less capital you can assign to sales and generating profits. The more violence you commit against other street gangs, the more likely they are to seek revenge, and the more likely you are to attract police attention. And so here we have something like a game tree, similar to what we presented in Gambetta, only instead of an informational asymmetry, we're maximizing again under the assumption of a prisoner's dilemma. We're paying the mafia in the same way that we pay Carfax to protect us in a sell-sell equilibrium. But this is still maximizing, right? The mafia needs to set its tax rates high enough, or low enough, I should say, that both parties choose to continue to sell over violence. So in the same way that peace over time grows villages, security round after round in the drug economy in a particular city or among a particular ethnicity maximizes attention to sales and minimizes the amount of capital that's dedicated to violence. Now, of course, this particular model assumes that the mafia in question is capable of punishing any street gang that defects. If they can't, the equilibrium changes pretty crucially. It is still, in this layout, in the best interests of the mafia-free drug-selling organization to defect and commit violence, because the amount of violence that they will experience as a result of confronting the mafia is minimal, right? So we need to have a set of drug gang citizens as a mafia that we have control over. And this is sort of the main innovation, Skarbek argues, that the Mexican mafia employed to make itself into a profitable mega business. How does the Mexican mafia choose its clients and keep them in line? Well, the Mexican mafia runs its governance organization entirely inside prisons. They have spent enough time, devoted enough capital to generating violence in prisons that they can credibly guarantee to provide not only violence against defectors, but some amount of rewards, minor rewards within the prison system to those that are playing along with the Mexican mafia's game. And so, when they decide whether or not to extort a drug gang, they look first and foremost to gangs that are likely to be incarcerated or have friends that are likely to be incarcerated, employees. Skarbek uses the term friends relatively loosely here. What we really mean is that our employees are going to be incarcerated. And if our employees are going to be incarcerated, we're not going to be able to attract any employees if we can't guarantee their safety in prison. And so as long as we have a strong enough gang, and the Mexican Mafia is a very strong and capable gang, we're likely to see the payment of taxes. Otherwise, we should expect no taxes, particularly where there's no incarceration of any parties likely. The Mexican Mafia has very little they can do to extort a legal business owner in a place like Los Angeles or San Diego, because those legal business owners can go to a relatively uncorrupted state, tell on the Mexican Mafia, and the government of California or the government of the United States will intercede in a way that imposes more costs on the Mexican Mafia than they would like to incur in order to have control over a particular business. That's not true with respect to prisons. Okay, so the genius of this prison gang model then is that it's a very efficient way to gain control over drug gangs. I can't remember if I have slides about this coming up, but why would the Mexican Mafia target only Hispanic drug selling organizations? Think about the limitations on intelligence gathering proposed in Gambetta. What is the advantage for a Hispanic mafia to target only Hispanic drug trafficking organizations? Well, you could imagine if a white mafia tried it, right? When I do this lecture in class, I gesture to myself and say, imagine that I walked into the headquarters of a local Hispanic drug selling organization and said, I'm going to find a way to punish you guys if you don't pay me taxes. Right? In principle, they all just start speaking Spanish, assuming that I don't, and I have no idea how to gather intelligence. No one's going to speak openly around me because I'm a tall, gangly white guy. I don't look the part at all. They know that I'm not going to be able to infiltrate their gang. Well, the Mexican Mafia understands the culture of Hispanic drug selling organizations. They have undercover operatives that easily pass the smell test, that can infiltrate these gangs and monitor what they're doing. Much more difficult for mafias of other races or other ethnicities to cultivate these sorts of intelligence procedures. Much easier for the drug gangs to root out when they're being observed by their mafia, and therefore it's easier to withhold information from them. Easier to make themselves illegible, going back to Scott. So we expect that these gangs are going to be ethnic. And in fact, Skarbek chooses to study the Mexican Mafia partly because they were one of the first organizations of this type to really explode onto the scene, and partly because they're one of the most successful and visible. But his new book, which deals more globally with how prison gangs and prison culture change and condition life on the outside, as he writes, there are white and Asian and black versions of these gangs. Okay, so with these two amendments to Olson's theory in mind, Skarbek derives a handful of hypotheses, right? Illicit markets should perform better. Drug cartels should get along, they should be more efficient when interfirm disputes are handled by an illicit court and an illicit enforcer. We also know that illicit enforcers must maintain jurisdiction over enough drug gangs to assure that the dispute resolution isn't undermined by defection. So here are our hypotheses. Prison gangs should extort organizations whose members are likely to go to prison, and they should not extort organizations whose members are not likely to go to prison. Prison gangs can't extort organizations who can guarantee their own members' safety in prison or whose members are unlikely to be in prison. Prison gangs should only extort organizations under the jurisdictions of the prisons that they run. And the prison gang should provide services to members of tax-paying organizations and withhold those services from others. The evidence here is relatively straightforward. The Mexican Mafia controls Hispanic drug distribution gangs in Southern California that pay taxes to it, and that's it. Members of drug gangs from other minorities don't pay these taxes to the Mexican Mafia. Hispanics with legal businesses don't pay taxes to the Mexican Mafia. Hispanic drug gangs outside of Southern California do not pay taxes to the Mexican Mafia. This was at least true At the time that Scarbeck wrote this paper, the Mexican Mafia has now expanded. It has units all over the country. It is a profitable business. Of course it would expand. The Mexican Mafia spends most of its resources controlling prison outcomes. It wants to control the prison outcomes first and foremost. Second, it attempts to police Hispanics who pretend to be members of the Mexican Mafia and collect taxes that are due to it. And then lastly, Mexican Mafia members rarely interact with members of other ethnicities, except when those ethnicities are threatening protected Hispanics. And so for this reason, obviously Scarbeck's treatment of this is much more detailed, and if you haven't done this reading, you should, because it's very interesting how he goes about proving that these things are true. Scarbeck argues that the only consistent theory of mafias that we can take from observing the Mexican Mafia is a state-centered view, a view that the primary goal and purpose of the organization is violence production and the suppression of defection among drug distribution gangs in Southern California. Okay, that is all that I have for today. I will see you all on Thursday.